Once upon a time, in the city of Port Harcourt, Rivers State, Nigeria, there lived two sisters, Linda and Tiwa, who lived completely different lives, and people often wondered if they were truly blood sisters. Linda, the older sister, was a school dropout who married a man 20 years older than herself. Her younger sister Tiwa was well educated and worked in an international company. The sisters were not particularly close, as Linda often appeared distinct and indifferent towards her sister Tiwa. One day, Tiwa returned home to visit their parents. She met Linda in the house and decided to share her exciting news. "I'm getting married," she said with a bright smile on her face. Their parents leaped for joy, hugging and congratulating her for the news. In the camp with joyful voice, Tiwa continued revealing to them that she was also pregnant. The room fell silent, as the joy that once filled the room disappeared. Tiwa sat there looking confused, as she wondered why her parents were suddenly quiet. After what felt like forever, her father spoke up and informed her to bring the man that had piqued an interest in marrying her. Linda could not hold back her anger. She stood up and stared at her parents, asking if they were going to sit back and watch this happen. "I knew it," Linda said, as she clenched her fist, her voice trembling with bitterness, as she poured out her mind to everyone that was present. Linda accused Tiwa of trying to mock her childlessness. "I knew you would stop at nothing to rub my predicament in my face. You got pregnant just to mock my childlessness," she said to Tiwa, who stood there frozen and unable to speak. Her smiles fading, as she stared at her sister in disbelief. "Linda, how could you even think that?" Tiwa asked softly, as she tried to calm her sister down. Their parents stood there confused, unsure of how to calm the storm that was now brewing between their daughters. But Linda had not finished bearing her mind. "All my life, I've been the one everyone hated. The one everyone whispered about behind closed doors. And now, you, perfect and successful Tiwa, have now come to mock my pain. You've even taken everything from me. And now, you've come to make a riddle of my situation." Tiwa's eyes filled with tears, as she stepped closer to her sister. "Linda, I have never ever tried to compete with you. I have never wished you harm for one day in my life. I only came here to share my joy with you, my family." But Linda turned away. Tears dropped down her eyes, as she stormed out of the house, leaving behind an awkward silence that pierced the heart of everyone present. Tiwa never got to understand why her sister Linda hated her this much. She sat there, confused, as she watched her mother speak to her sister on the phone. "Tell her to abort that pregnancy if she ever wants peace in this family," Linda said to her mother, as she hung up the phone. Tiwa stood there frozen, as she overheard her sister's demand over the phone. The joy of her pregnancy, as well as her upcoming marriage, was overshadowed by her sister's bitterness. Tiwa tried to shake off the pain, telling herself that Lina was simply hurting and didn't mean her words, but deep inside, Tiwa knew that Linda was dead serious. The parents decided to call for a family meeting to address the issues between Linda and her sister, but Linda refused to show up to the meeting. Tiwa, being so loving and kind, decided to pay her sister a visit at home to see if she could have a word with her. She knocked on Linda's door repeatedly, but Linda refused to let her in. Tiwa, determined to have a word with her sister, stood there, as she sang her sister's favorite song repeatedly. She remembered how Linda always loved to sing the song to her when they were little, and believed that Linda would have a change of heart when she heard the song, but her plans didn't work out as she planned. Linda angrily walked out of the house and poured her bucket of soapy water. She wouldn't have never to come to her house again, informing her that she was dead to her. Tiwa watched as Linda banged the door to her face, her entire body drenched in soapy water. As she turned around and walked away, the neighbors peeked through their windows as they whispered amongst themselves. They could not understand why Linda hated her younger sister this much. Linda had spent years building walls around herself, shutting her sister out completely. To her, Tiwa was a symbol of everything that she had lost: opportunities, affection, and now even the dream of motherhood. In Linda's eyes, Tiwa had taken everything from her. She believed their parents loved Tiwa more, praising her more, and overlooked her own struggles. Linda had convinced herself that her sister was to blame for every misfortune in her life. Tiwa was so heartbroken. She could not contain her tears. She loved her sister so much and wished that things were different between them. She returned home and decided to speak to her fiancé, who advised her to stay away from her sister for now. "How can your sister suggest that you abort our baby? Is it because she has no child of her own?" he asked Tiwa, who burst out in tears and began to cry. Weeks passed, and their wedding preparations began. Tiwa tried several to reach her sister, but Linda refused to pick her clothes. She left so many messages and Linda never responded to any of them. Tiwa decided to pay her sister a visit again. This time, she hoped to deliver her wedding invitation to her, hoping that she attends her wedding, which was now in a few weeks. But Linda ignored her persistent knocks. Tiwa then decided to slide the card underneath the door. She left a small note with the card, apologizing to Linda for anything that she could have done. Tiwa stood outside the door for a moment, hoping for any sign of acknowledgement from Linda. But the silence remained unbroken. With a heavy heart, Tiwa turned and walked away. She left her apology resting on the other side of the door as she returned home, hopeful that things would change. The day of their wedding finally arrived. Tiwa looked so stunning in her wedding dress. Her face was glowing with happiness, despite the sadness that lingered in her eyes. Tiwa left one seat empty in the front row, hoping until the very last moment that Linda would walk through the door and be part of their special day. But as expected, her sister Linda never showed up. She was seated in her living room, watching a television program whilst her sister's wedding was ongoing. She could not bring herself to attend the wedding, knowing that her sister was pregnant. Linda could feel the bitterness in her heart. She could not help but blame her younger sister for all the things that she had been through in life. Her in-laws made her life a living hell. They blamed Linda for her childlessness and made a mockery of her at every given opportunity. Whenever someone in the family announced their pregnancy, Linda's mother-in-law would make mocking remarks at her. She constantly compared Linda to her co-wives, who were educated, her children, and seemed to bring pride to the family. The comparisons were relentless, with her mother-in-law asking why she chose to be useless. Whenever there was an important family celebration, Linda was either given menial tasks in the background or outrightly excluded from attending. She often sat at home alone, whilst her husband and his family celebrated without her. On one occasion, during a family party, her sister-in-law openly mocked her for not being able to conceive. "Maybe you should try some herbal remedies," she said loudly, causing others to laugh whilst Linda stood frozen with embarrassment. Whenever she visited her in-laws in their home, they treated her like a maid. Linda was expected to cook, clean, and serve everyone without rest, whilst her sisters-in-law relaxed and enjoyed themselves. Even her husband began to neglect her feelings, often ignoring the fact that his family despised and ridiculed her. One morning, Linda received a text from her sister, informing her that she was at the hospital. Her baby was coming, and yet she wished for Linda to be around. "I am naming her after you, Linda Princewell." The message read. As Tiwa told her sister how much she loved her, Linda sat there with the message in her hand. She could not believe that her sister planned on naming her baby after her. "What nonsense is this?" she said to herself angrily, as she got dressed and headed to the hospital. Linda saw this move as the height of mockery. She decided to head to the hospital to warn Tiwa not to name her child after her. She got into the car and drove to the hospital, which was an hour away from her home. When she arrived at the hospital, she met her mother and brother-in-law in tears. Her sister Tiwa had just passed, leaving her newborn daughter and husband behind. Linda froze as the word sank in. Her mother sobbed, echoed in her ears, and her brother-in-law sat on the hospital bench, his face buried in his hand. The anger she had brought with her, the fire that had brought her to the hospital, dissolved into cold ashes. "No, it can't be," Linda whispered, clutching her chest as though trying to hold her head together. She stood there shaking as she watched her mother approach. "She loved you, Linda. She loved you so much, even in her final moment. She asked for you," her mother said with tears in her eyes. Linda's body shook as the guilt pierced her soul. All the anger, the resentment, the world she had built around herself, crumbled like a fragile sandcastle against an unyielding tide. "She wanted to name her baby after you, Linda," her mother continued, through her tears. "She said it was her way of showing you how much she loved you, despite everything that had happened." The weight of those words felt unbearable. Linda had spent so long resenting her sister Tiwa, believing she had stolen her happiness, that she never paused to see the love her sister had for her. And now she stood there wishing that she acted better, or she was already too late. The door to Tiwa's hospital room was slightly ajar and Linda walked in to see her sister's lifeless body lying on the hospital bed, her face serene as though she had simply fallen asleep. Her newborn baby lay in the corner asleep as Linda approached them with shaky hands. Linda looked down at the child, whose name was also Linda Princewell. Her heart broke into 8,000 pieces as she felt the weight of her sister's love. "I'm so sorry," Linda whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't realize how much she loved me. I let my pain blind me and now, you're gone." Linda broke down into it as the nurse gently escorted her out of the hospital ward. Her mother stood at the door silently watching the scene. She had never seen Linda so vulnerable in her life and knew that she contributed to her pain. She approached Linda and apologized for all the horrible things that she did to her. Linda stood there broken as she felt the whole world collapsed in on her. Everyone saw her as a bitter woman, not knowing that beneath her bitterness was a story. It all began so many years ago when Linda fell in love with a young man named Chris. He was kind, hardworking and full of dreams. Their love was pure, and despite their financial struggles, they believed they could build a life together. When Linda found out that she was pregnant, she was terrified but hopeful. She thought Chris would marry her and they would start a family together, but when she shared the news with her parents, everything began to go south. "You can't disgrace this family, Linda. You will not have a child out of wedlock," her father said. Her mother cried bitterly, lamenting how the family name would be dragged through the mud. They forced Linda to have an abortion, telling her it was for her own good. Chris, devastated by the news, gathered the courage to formally ask for Linda's hand in marriage, but her parents rejected him outright because of his state of origin. "He can let her daughter marry someone from there," her father said coldly as he chased Chris away, warning him never to step his foot in their home again. Chris left heartbroken and Linda's world shattered before her eyes. Out of desperation, Linda planned to run away with Chris. They planned on starting over somewhere far away where no one knew who they were, but young Tiwa, who was only 10 years old at the time, overheard her sister's plans and innocently told their parents, thinking that she was protecting Linda from doing something wrong. That night, Linda was beaten mercilessly. Her father's belt left deep marks on her skin and her mother's words cut even deeper than the scars. "You are a disgrace to this family," her mother said as she locked her in her room for days. Chris eventually left the city, and Linda never saw him again. Her mother took her to have an abortion, not caring about the consequences. Linda lost her will to continue her studies. She dropped out of school and withdrew from the entire world. Her parents, seeing that she had decided not to further her education, introduced her to Chief Obi, a man who was 20 years older than Linda. He was a very wealthy man who picked an interest in her and wanted to marry her. Linda's parents convinced her to marry him, saying that doing so would bring their family out of poverty. Desperate for acceptance, Linda agreed, but her marriage was loveless. Chief Obi was distant, and the years passed with no sign of children. The abortion she was forced to have had taken away her ability to conceive. Her husband grew older over time and his family treated her like a burden. Linda lives with the crushing guilt of her past and the emptiness of her present. Every smile on Tiwa's face reminded Linda of the life that she could have had. The love, the joy, the freedom to make her own choices. She saw Tiwa as the golden child. The one who escaped their parents' harsh control and got to live the life of her dreams. In Linda's eyes, it wasn't fair. She saw Tiwa's success, her happiness, and her pregnancy as a deliberate reminder of everything that she had lost. So, she poured her frustration on Tiwa, the one person who had loved her unconditionally. Tiwa had become a scapegoat for all the pain, regret, and unhealed wounds that Linda had endured. But standing there, staring at her sister's lifeless body, Linda realized the heavy weight of her choices and misplaced anger. She decided to let it all go. Knowing that the damage had already been done, she apologized to Tiwa's husband for how badly she treated them. She narrated the whole story to him, tears pouring down her face as she confessed every detail. The abortion, the rejection of Chris, her first marriage to Chief Obi, and the deep scars that had shaped her bitterness. Tiwa's husband listened intently, his eyes softening as he saw the shattered woman that was right before him. "Linda," he said gently, "I forgive you. Tiwa loved you so much and she would want you to find peace." Linda broke down into tears as she felt a flick of relief in his forgiveness. She devoted herself to caring for her niece Linda Princewell, and in those quiet moments as she held the baby in her arms, she began to feel something that she hadn't felt in years. Love, pure and undiluted love. However, life wasn't done testing Linda. Chief Obi, who had long grown tired of her presence, married another woman, a younger, more vibrant bride, chosen by his family. One fateful afternoon, Linda returned home to find her belongings packed in bags on the doorstep. "You are no longer welcome here," her husband said coldly. Without meeting her eyes, his new wife stood in the background smirking. His family had ensured that every legal document was in his favor. Linda had no claim to anything, not the house, not the wealth, and certainly not his loyalty. Broken and humiliated, Linda returned to her parents' home with only a small bag of clothes. And mother welcomed her silently. Guilt aged on her face, while her father avoided her gaze entirely. Days turned into weeks and the weight of her failures pressed heavily on her, desperate to escape her own thoughts. Linda decided to visit her niece, hoping that the baby's smile might bring her some comfort. When she arrived at Tiwa's husband's house, she knocked hesitantly, clutching a small teddy bear in her hand. The door opened, and there stood a tall man, his presence commanding yet warm. "Linda," he said in disbelief. Linda threw, staring at the familiar face. "Chris," she whispered. It was him, her Chris. His hair was shorter, streaks with faint sands of grey, but his deep eyes were still as kind as she remembered. "I didn't know you would be here," Linda stammered. Chris smiled faintly. "I came to visit my cousin, after I returned from abroad. I had no idea his wife was your sister, or that you were the same Linda I once loved." The air between them cracked with unspoken words, years of pain and regret hanging heavily in the silence. "Please come in," Chris said softly. Inside, little Linda was sleeping peacefully in her crib. Chris glanced at her and smiled. "She looks just like Tiwa, she's beautiful." Linda felt tears prick her eyes. They sat down in the living room, and for the first time in decades Linda shared everything with Chris, the pain, the guilt, the years of isolation and bitterness. Chris listened, his eyes filled with compassion. "Linda," he said after a long pause. "You were filled by so many people, but it's not too late to rewrite your story." Linda nodded as tears streamed down her face. Chris had spent his years focused on his work, that he never had time for women. He was now a successful medical doctor, and Linda could not believe how life had smiled on him. Over the next few weeks, Chris and Linda began to rebuild their connection. He visited often, spending time with little Linda Princewell, and shared stories with Linda. Slowly, the walls Linda had built around her heart began to crumble, and for the first time in years, she felt truly seen and understood. Chris was gentle, patient, and kind, never rushing Linda to confront emotions that she wasn't ready for. His presence brought a quiet calmness to the chaotic world. One evening, as they sat on the couch, Chris asked Linda if she remembered when they used to sit on the mango tree by her house, talking about their dreams. Linda smiled faintly, her gaze distant. "Yes, you always said you wanted to become a doctor, and I wanted to become a lawyer." Chris looked at her intently. "You deserve happiness, Linda. You've been carrying this pain for so long, and it's time to let it go. We can't change the past, or we can't choose what happens next." Linda looked at him, her eyes glistening with tears. "Chris, I don't know if I can't. I'm so broken. I've made so many mistakes." Chris gently took her hand. "We are all broken in some way, Linda, but sometimes the crack is what lets the light in." As months passed, Linda gradually opened herself up to healing. She focused on caring for her niece Linda Princewell, showering her with all the love that she had in her heart. Chris was always there, offering support and encouragement and warmth. One evening, Chris invited Linda to his home. It was a quiet evening, and Chris had taken the time to prepare dinner. Linda was so delighted. They sat and ate, as Chris reminded Linda of all the beautiful times that they had in the past. Linda could not help but giggle at the stories that brought back so many memories. Chris then handed a small box to her as he watched her open it with a smile. "Linda, I have loved you since we were young. Despite everything that happened, that love never died. I know we can't erase the past, but we can build a new future together. Will you let me love you? Will you let me stand by your side and help you heal?" Linda's hand trembled as she opened the box to find a ring. Her heart pounded in her chest. And first time in years, Linda felt something warm and pure. "Yes, Chris," she whispered through her tears, as Chris screamed out in excitement. Linda and Chris took their time building their life together. They didn't rush into marriage but instead focused on healing and creating beautiful memories. Linda gradually reconciled with her parents. Her mother, wrapped with guilt, worked out to make amends, while her father, though slower to express his regret, began to show subtle signs of remorse through his actions. Chief Reby, on the other hand, spiraled into financial troubles as his new wife squandered his wealth and then looked with her lover. Karma, it seemed, had found its way back to him. But Linda no longer carried hatred or bitterness in her heart. She had found peace in the love she shared with Chris and enjoyed that came with it. They got married and Linda found out months later that she was pregnant. Chris had put her on the fertility treatment that worked, and Linda was now carrying her own child. The news came as a miracle. One brought tears of joy to Linda's eyes. She clutched the pregnancy test tightly, her hands trembling as she whispered some heartfelt thanks to God. Chris was also delighted. She pulled her into his arms as they held each other tightly. Their tears mixed with laughter. "This child is our blessing, Linda," Chris said softly, "a fresh start, a sign that love can heal even the deepest wounds." The months that followed were filled with laughter as Linda finally gave birth to twin babies. Her years of suffering finally ended as Linda lived the remainder of her life in joy. Her husband and children filled the void that she never knew could be filled. Her parents learned bitter lessons never to sacrifice their children's happiness for societal approval. Linda's life was shaped by her parents' decisions, driven by societal expectations and fear of shame. Their insistence on aborting her pregnancy and rejecting the man that she loved led to years of bitterness, regret and suffering. Therefore, this story teaches us those parental decisions, driven by societal pressure and fear of shame, can have devastating consequences on their children's lives. It highlights the importance of allowing children to make choices rooted in love and happiness rather than societal expectations. Bitterness and unresolved trauma can destroy relationships and prevent healing. While forgiveness, unconditional love and self-reflection are powerful tools for breaking free from cycles of pain. The story also emphasizes that it's never too late for redemption, healing and second chances, and that's love. Both romantic and familial has the power to restore even the most broken hearts. Finally, it serves as a reminder that our true happiness comes from embracing love, letting go of resentment and choosing to build a future free from the chains of the past. Thank you for watching and I hope you enjoyed the story.